The date is May 1st, 1933 in Moscow, and spectators are given quite a sight in this year's parade. An enormous, lumbering steel beast roars past them with a clatter of tracks, absolutely bristling with guns. They have just witnessed the latest in tank technology from the Red Army in the form of the first prototype of the new T-35 heavy tank. Much like the ideology behind their creation, though, time would reveal that this display of technological prestige would fall short of the powerful vehicle it was envisioned to be. Like many vehicles from the early days of tank design, both during World War I and during the interwar period, the T-35 is often referred to as a landship. In fact, there are many terms associated with tanks which trace back to naval terminology, such as referring to the body of a tank as the hull. Similarly, this video on a tank is linked to naval forces through today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends. World of Warships Legends is a free-to-play online multiplayer game allowing you to set sail on your Xbox, PlayStation, or mobile device. Take control of an ever-growing number of ships from 11 nations, including many American warships which fought in the two world wars. Whether you like fast-hitting destroyers, heavily armored battleships, jack-of-all-trades cruisers, or want to support your team with an aircraft carrier, there is something for players of all types to enjoy. As part of the American Independence Day celebration in-game, you can also earn the special Independium currency to spend on rewards like the Tier 7 Rochester or the legendary cruiser Puerto Rico. Start playing today using my link below on your console, and be sure to grab the free Beacon of Liberty DLC, including a 14-day rental of the Tier 4 Destroyer Hill, the Tier 5 Battleship New Mexico, and red, white, and blue camos for your ships. Thanks to them for supporting the channel. Now let's move back to our discussion of the T-35. Although, as mentioned in the intro, the debut of the T-35 would not occur until 1933, its origins can be traced back several years earlier. You could even argue the seeds for its eventual creation were sown almost 10 years prior with the British A1E1 Independent. In fact, a Soviet book in my collection from 1947 even notes that vehicle as being influential to the design. This is not to say it was a copy or derived from that vehicle in any major way, though. The development which would eventually lead to the T-35 began following the recruitment of Eduard Groth and other German engineers as part of a joint Soviet-German program. Some sources instead refer to him as Ernst Groth. I'm not sure the exact reason for this discrepancy, but I believe both names do refer to the same individual. In typical German fashion, Groth was quite interested in heavy tank designs, and you may be familiar with some of his other work, such as the 1,000-ton Rat. He had actually been proposing massive vehicles like this since the early 30s, but that is a story for another day. As it pertains to the T-35, his involvement can be seen in work on the TG-1 medium tank project and proposals for considerably heavier fortress tank designs. Most significantly, though, would be his team's work culminating in the TG-5, a massive 5-turreted behemoth weighing 100 tons and featuring a 107mm main armament. With the cost and manufacturing of such a vehicle being all but impossible for the Soviet industry, both the TG-1 tank and the TG-5 were rejected for production. Following Groth's return to Germany in 1932, though, a second team would pick up where they left off, putting forward their own design based on new requirements. Still featuring 5 turrets and a weight of 35 tons, these would serve as breakthrough tanks and would become some of the heaviest and most powerfully armed tanks of their day. The first 2 of these were built in July of 1932 and differed massively from the T-35 you may be familiar with. In fact, these are pretty much entirely different tanks, sharing little more than the same name and similar overall layout. These featured 6 road wheels per side, a completely different hull design, different auxiliary turrets, 37mm secondary guns, a different 76.2mm gun, and a hull-mounted machine gun. The first prototype also featured a different, more rounded turret compared to the second prototype's turret taken from the T-28 medium tank, which would be carried over to the production tanks. The two prototypes each featured a different engine and transmission as well, with the first using a M6 aircraft engine, with the second instead using the M17L, a Soviet-built licensed copy of the BMW 6 V12 aircraft engine. Reportedly, the second prototype was viewed less as a prototype for the final design and more as an interim testbed for the transmission. German influence can also be found with the road wheels, which were based on the Grosstraktor design, which underwent trials in the Soviet Union. I have a previous video on that tank if you're interested. If you'd like to read more about how to identify these prototypes compared to the production examples, I highly recommend the Tank Encyclopedia article by Francis Pulham or the sourcebooks linked below on the subject. Approval for production of the T-35 would come in May 1933, before trials of the T-35-2 had even begun. Considering the vast changes made for the final design, this lack of trials would be unlikely to correct any problems with the production vehicle aside from flaws with the aforementioned shared transmission and gearbox. Although both vehicles were still designated as the T-35, most modern sources differentiate the two by referring to the production vehicle as the T-35A. I will simply refer to them as T-35 for the remainder of this video, but wanted to mention that to prevent any confusion if you see the T-35A name used elsewhere. Production of the T-35 would occur in the Kharkov locomotive factory located in what is now modern-day Ukraine, beginning in late 1933, with the first being completed in August of 1934. With production plans calling for 10 to be completed during 1934, pressure was put on the factory to speed up production in order for 6 tanks to be ready for a parade in Moscow that November. Between the limited infrastructure to build these massive tanks and the purging of factory staff, it's no surprise that production was so slow. The pressure seems to have been effective though, as not only were the 6 tanks completed for the parade, but by the end of the year the full 10 were indeed completed. Production of the T-35 continued for the next 5 years, with a total of 59 being produced between 1934 and 1939. Some sources place this number a bit higher, with it ranging between 59 and 63, including the 2 prototypes. As mentioned earlier, these were significantly different from the 2 prototypes we already looked at. The production T-35 was an immense vehicle measuring just under 32 feet, 9.72 meters long, 10.5 feet, 3.2 meters wide, and 11 feet, 3 inches, 3.43 meters tall. This was considerably larger than the previous design, with this necessitating the addition of 2 more road wheels per side. The secondary turrets were now taken from the BT-5 light tank, with them housing 45mm K-20 cannons instead of the 37s. The primary turret and smaller machine gun turrets were shared with the T-28, with the primary armament now being a KT-28 76.2mm cannon. Contrary to what you might think, the larger 76.2mm was intended for use supporting infantry, while the smaller, higher velocity 45s would be in charge of dealing with enemy tanks. Just like the T-28, some of these feature what may at first look like a large handle around the turret. This is actually the tank's antenna, and you can find these on various tanks of the time period, commonly being referred to as a horseshoe antenna. Additionally, later production vehicles featured a mount for a machine gun on the turret roof to be used in an AA role. As for the armor thickness, it was less impressive than the firepower, with it only being 30mm on the front, 20mm on the sides, and 10mm on the rear. While this may seem thin for a heavy tank, and by the time they entered service it certainly was, bear in mind that most tanks during the 30s still featured quite thin armor. Changes to this would also be made during production, with later examples featuring thicker armor and conical turrets, with the vast majority of the armor on these vehicles still being only 20 to 25mm of armor though. The thicker hull front was not a massive improvement for their survivability. To power this Landship, the same M17L Soviet-built licensed copy of the BMW 12-cylinder engine was used, producing 580 horsepower. A diesel engine was also tested on one vehicle, with proposals for an 800 horsepower diesel, however, neither would be adopted for production. The engine fed into a 4-speed gearbox which drove the almost 83 feet, 25.2 meter long tracks, each of which were made up of 135 cast links. This moved the 54-ton tank along at a maximum of about 17.9 miles per hour, 28.9 kilometers per hour on roads, and 8.7 miles per hour, 14 kilometers per hour off-road, with a range of about 62 miles, 100 kilometers. For suspension, the T-35 used a coil spring system with each pair of road wheels having 2 springs which were covered by a 10mm armored plate bolted to the side. The slow speed was only part of the mobility issues which plagued the T-35, with one report noting it struggled to climb a 17-degree incline despite being rated for 20 degrees. One of the most staggering aspects of this tank was the size of the crew used to operate it. Each T-35 featured up to 12 crew members, including a driver, commander, 3 gunners, 3 loaders, 2 machine gunners, and 2 mechanics. Some sources give a total crew count of 10 or 11, and this I presume is due to the removal of one or both mechanics. Even with the slightly reduced count, this still makes it one of the largest crews of any tank, only beaten by a few vehicles such as the A7V, which carried nearly 20 men. The T-35's crew was split between 3 compartments, with the front compartment containing the driver and front turrets, the next compartment containing the main turret, and the rear compartment housed the rear 2 turrets. 2 further compartments behind these housed the engine and transmission. Normally, this is where I stop in regards to the crew in these videos, but a vehicle like the T-35 is unique not just for the size of the crew, it also featured an interesting division of labor amongst that crew. According to one breakdown from a Soviet source translated in the book Land Battleship, the Russian T-35 heavy tank, despite the size of the crew, many of the crew members were assigned a fairly significant workload. For example, the commander of the tank in the main turret not only had to command the tank itself, but would also control the machine gun and load the 76.2mm cannon. This is the same in the 45mm turrets, with the loaders also acting as commanders for their respective turret, with the document listing a total of 5 different commanders conducting various aspects of the tank and its firepower. As we have previously discussed in my video on multi-turreted tanks, this no doubt would lead to a too many cooks in the kitchen type of situation in combat. This likely didn't make too much of an impact on their combat performance though, as many were destroyed not due to enemy fire, but from mechanical failures or from the sheer bulk of the vehicle. During their early service life, the T-35s would be used as training vehicles along with serving as a symbol of the mighty Red Army being featured in parades as well as various Soviet propaganda pieces. The tank even features on the Medal for Courage awarded by both the Soviet Union and modern Russia. They would finally get a taste for combat following the German invasion in 1941, but we'll get to that in a bit. While the T-35s roared along the streets of Moscow for the masses to see, development continued on the heavy tank program. The Soviets were well aware of the limitations the T-35 had, particularly when it came to armor, and as we have already discussed, explorations of increasing the armor were undertaken. However, doing this and keeping the vehicle's weight from significantly increasing simply couldn't be done for such a large vehicle. Even before production had begun, discussions of various future designs under the T-39 designation were held during 1933. The true replacement to the T-35 would come later though, following new requirements issued in 1937. This would lead to 3 competing designs vying for the chance to be the next Soviet heavy tank, those being the SMK, T-100, and the eventual winner, the KV-1. Aspects of the T-35 can still be seen in some of these, with the early SMK featuring a similar coil spring style suspension and featuring 3 turrets. This multi-turreted nonsense would finally end with the adoption of the KV-1, but that is a story for another day. The chassis of the T-35 itself would not carry over to other designs aside from 2 prototype heavy artillery vehicles. Known as the Su-14, a prototype was built in 1934 armed with the 203mm B-4 howitzer. Lengthened even further to around 33 feet 10 meters, a large open platform was added in place of the turrets, with the driver now located near the engine and transmission. A second, more modernized version of this, known as the Su-14-1, was also constructed in 1936, with the engine power being increased from 500 horsepower on the original to 700 horsepower, along with other improvements. Trials of these would lead to the weapon being changed to the 152mm U-30 on the Su-14 and the 152mm BR-2 on the Su-14-1 to improve range and therefore increase their effectiveness. Production of a further 5 vehicles was ordered to be completed in 1938, however, Stalin's itchy trigger finger had other ideas and the Su-14's designer was executed along with any hope for a continuation of the project. As for the T-35, their combat debut would eventually come, but only out of necessity. They had sat unused during the Soviet invasion of Finland during 1939 while their replacements were combat tested, but when the Germans came blasting their way into the USSR, the Red Army began scraping together everything they could to try and stop them, including the T-35s. Deployed with the 8th Mechanized Corps, this fleet of landships joined the attempts to blockade the surging wave of German tanks. Despite them being significantly outdated, these were still completely capable of destroying enemy armor thanks to the powerful 45mm guns and their excellent anti-tank ability. Unfortunately, their weaponry would only be useful if the tanks could get them into battle, and the T-35 was simply incapable to do so. Within less than a month, almost all the T-35s were lost, with most breaking down and being abandoned. To take a line from the Pirates of the Caribbean series, any tank who falls behind is left behind, and many T-35s were left behind. These remained scattered across western Ukraine as the Red Army was pushed further and further east. Several did remain in service, with 2 assisting in the defense of Moscow and others fighting the war on the big screen through scripted propaganda films. Remarkably, it would not be until the end of the war in 1945 that the last T-35 would see combat, with photographic evidence showing a single T-35 near Berlin, presumably being used by the Germans to defend against the Red Army who were now pushing into their homeland. This was likely the same vehicle shown in this photo, which was captured in 1941 and brought to Kummersdorf as a trophy. The Su-14s may have also gotten a taste of combat during defense of the Soviet Union from their home at Kubinka. Prior to the invasion, but following the disastrous winter war with Finland, these had been modified through the addition of armored enclosures for their fighting compartments. This armor was intended to allow them to serve as bunker-busting assault guns, but would have done little for them in a longer-range support role, which they may have served during the defense of the homeland. Overall, the T-35 and its derivatives are a perfect snapshot of a brief period in the history of tank design. As a designer during the 20s and 30s, you could be forgiven for believing the future of tank development would be similar to that of warships. Large, lumbering, tracked beasts growing ever larger and more heavily armored, and in a way, this is exactly what happened. However, the multi-turreted aspect of the T-35 led to nothing but problems, requiring the tank to grow larger and heavier. The already high weight made it impossible to add true heavy tank levels of protection as well, leaving it as a huge, slow target with very little armor. One thing they did succeed in, though, was to serve as an effective display of Soviet engineering and tank development, which had produced the most numerous and arguably most powerful tank force on the planet during the 30s. Despite their flaws, they were impressive feats of engineering, especially for a nation which had just undergone a bloody civil war and still dealt with extreme political tensions. Today, only a single original T-35 remains, one of the 2 which fought in the defense of Moscow, now on display at the Kubinka Tank Museum. The Su-14-1 prototype also remains on display there, still featuring the armored body it received in 1940. Sadly, its brother the Su-14 was scrapped after the war in the 1960s. A full-scale replica of the T-35 has also been built relatively recently, with this participating in various events following its completion. Fittingly, the tank which for so much of its life served as a parade vehicle will now be able to continue that legacy for another generation almost 100 years after the first T-35 rumbled along the streets of Moscow. But what do you think of this landlocked warship? Let me know down in the comments, and be sure to check out that link to try out World of Warships Legends to take control of some considerably bigger ships in the water where they belong. Thanks again to them for sponsoring this video. You can also check out the link to my merch store in the description, where you can pick up your very own T-35 Jack sticker or any of my other designs. Thank you all for watching, and to all of my ConelyFans for their support of this channel and content. If you liked this video, consider checking out some of my previous ones on multi-turreted tanks, including the SMK and T-100. Hope to see you there, or in my next video.